Hello, welcome back to the Quality Matters Daily Dive, brought to you by Texas Quality Interesting, called Process Map. So we're going to take a look a little bit at what's known as the Deming Cycle or the PDCA Cycle, Continuous Improvement Model. Lots of names for it, but it's the basic way that we go about process approach. And this is a method that we utilize at Texas Quality Assurance. So we'll kind of help make sense of it all, because the PDCA cycle, which if you're not familiar with, is plan, do, check, act. Pretty much what it sounds like. We'll look into it a little bit, but it's not always a useful business tool. It's a wonderful way to think through a process, but not always the best way to execute on it. So give me a second here and I will get my screen shared. Should have had that pulled up already. And here we go. Now, we're going to actually be pulling from some of our QMS Boot Camp course material for this. So if you're not aware, we have a training program that we've done for a number of years now called the QMS Boot Camp. And so this is just a little small excerpt from some of the material in our QMS Boot Camp series. So we're going to start here by looking at the basics of what's known as the PDCA cycle, plan, do, check, act. Now, I want to make a note here that in the original version of this, it was not the plan, do, check, act. It was the plan, do, study, act. So right here where we have check, this was originally study, and it was the PDCA model. But when you're trying to sell an idea to the masses and to try to get a large number of folks to go through it, when you say plan, do, study, this is a little bit of a holdup here. So it has been modified to the plan, do, check, act model, but is still effectively what Edward Deming had planned, the entire time. Now, you may have seen this diagram. Let me pull this in here real quick. In your management system standards, and here, explode that. There we go. So this is probably the model you've seen before. It's effectively the same thing we have here. This is what they put in the ISO 9001 standard. I'm sorry. They tried hard and did a somewhat good job of it, but you really have to study this model to get it. So they tried to map the clauses of the standard here from clause 7 for support and operations and planning, but it's a clunky model. But what we do get is the clear inputs over here on the left to the outputs on the right, and all of the process activities happen in the middle. So remember that piece, but I'm not going to torture you with going through this diagram anymore. But plan, do, study, act, really, really vitally important. And this just makes sense to the way we make decisions and the way we operate on a regular basis anyways. This is effectively common sense put to pen and paper. So if you're going to do anything, you plan it, regardless what it is. You're going to eat a meal. You're going to drive to work. You have a plan. So if you're driving to work, sometimes that plan's Google tells you where to go, but you've taken the route before. You have to think about traffic this time of day. You have to plan for your fuel and all these other things. And these become inputs into your process of driving to work. We have to have the vehicle maintenance. We have to have the fuel. We have to have all these different things in place. We have to have the resources. We have to have the road to operate on. So all of this stuff gets pulled into that process. Then you have the actual task of driving. So that is the do part of it. Then the check. You may be checking the time here because traffic's rough. Oh man, I'm going to be late. I know I'm about to be 10 minutes late. What do I need to do? Then you have the opportunity to take an action, and this becomes a cyclical process. So if you're repeatedly late by 10 minutes, calling your boss and saying, hey boss, traffic sucks, I'm late. There's only so many times you can do that before we have to have a better way to operate. So let's look at that a little bit more. Here's the diagram from ISO. Again, not going to dive into it too much here. It's a little confusing. Maybe a little bit better way to take a look at plan, do, check, act. We always start with a plan, but this becomes a cycle. So we have the plan in this case. We have all the necessary inputs for driving. Then we are on the road driving. we're checking our time. Maybe we're going to be late. Maybe we're on time every day. Maybe we're early every day. Now, if you're like me, 5 minutes early is already 10 minutes late, but that's kind of my own personal philosophy. But let's say you're repeatedly showing up to work late every day. Well, then we obviously failed something on our check. So our act needs to have a revision into our plan. So we need to plan to leave earlier on these days. Or maybe you recognize that traffic patterns are worse on Mondays or Fridays, but you get the opportunity then to revise your plan. So when we're talking quality management lingo, that act can either be leave as is or revise the plan, in which case you'd likely have a corrective action. Okay, so this kind of makes sense. This is just the way we function in normal day-to-day life. Now, if we're going to start saying we want to document a process, this is not a good tool for documenting your process. It's a great tool for understanding it, but really not the best tool for documenting the process. So that is where we are going to jump into what we call an integrative process approach. The idea here is that we can now link one process to the next, the inputs of one to the outputs of another, the checks of one, what process is that pulling from into it, so that ultimately all the inputs and outputs, all the checks and measures, the goals, the objectives, the controls, everything is interlinked together. Now, doesn't mean you have to show all the linkages like that in some massive Visio document. Oh, heck no. This is a fantastic way to dig in and analyze your process and what's going on. So oftentimes when there's some sort of an issue and we just can't get our head around what's going on, why do we keep having repeat problems here? This is a really great way to look at it, because you can then identify each individual input, each individual piece of your process controls. How are you checking it? Maybe your inspection methods are bad and you're not able to find the problem, but we get to look at everything very granular. So let's go back to the diagram here. It's very simple. I do this very often on just big sheets of chart paper. So let me go ahead and insert a blank slide here. Let's put that as just a blank layout. There we go. That's better. Let me get rid of these boxes here. No, I don't want design ideas. Oh, it's a fun feature they've got in here. So when you're doing a process map, I always tell folks to start out with 6 boxes here. The easiest way to do it. I love to do this on chart paper. Let folks come up, stencil on it, mark up on it, throw Post-its up there, take off. Really great exercise. But we identify our inputs, identify our outputs, and everything, of course, runs in this direction. Now, you might be asking, well, Kyle, how's this really line up with the PDCA cycle? Okay, well, we've got that here. In order to set this up, we have to have a plan. We want to plan, and that occurs largely in our inputs and our process controls. Our process controls then moves into the work that we do when we follow and execute those. So I didn't put this up here. I probably should. So we've got our process itself, and then we have our process controls. Now, process control is a fancy word for procedure, work instruction, specification, some sort of documented information or, best practice that tells us how to do the work, that tells us how to do the do. So all of this is the plan. This is the do. So we'll get there. Then we want to identify what is the goal of this process. Why does it even exist? Now, I'll tell you, a lot of times, if you have a process that just isn't working, you keep getting bad outputs, you're wasting time and effort, problems keep occurring, this goal was poorly defined. And so folks are expecting one output with a different goal in mind, and it just messes things up all the way around. We have a great example of this in the podcast. Check out the episode. I need to see what the episode number is, but it's we call it the 3 Stooges of accident investigation. And I talked a lot about this because we had this issue at a previous company I worked at where folks got hurt. There was tons of money being thrown into this process. And ultimately, what we figured out is we had a very poorly defined goal for the process itself. And so none of the outputs were quite right. And we had tons of additional costs going into it. So it was all out of alignment. The last thing we have here are we call our checks and measures. This only makes sense. You want to identify ahead of time how I'm going to check for success. Well, in something as simple as driving, well, what's our check over here? Our check over here for something as simple as driving to and from work. Let's choose a different color, and let's get a little bit thinner one here. So our checks and measures here, we might say on time arrival. Maybe there's multiple paths you could take to get to your destination. So we might want to say, minimum drive time, and we're going to review over a 2-week span of time. Okay, that makes sense. So our process here is drive to work. Simple enough process. Now, again, we could model this with all sorts of different, more complex processes that we have going on in a workplace, but it's simple enough here. So the output is pretty simple. Arrive on time and safely. Very simple output. Our goal here, you'll find oftentimes the output here matches the goal close to verbatim. When they don't, let's pause the question. So what is the goal of driving to work? Now, there's multiple ways to get to work. You could get an Uber, you could drive, you could bike, all sorts of different ways that you can get to the office. So what is the goal here? We want to have a consistent method of arriving to work on time. Okay. It's pretty straightforward. Now, let's say you live near a number of coworkers and your goal was to ride share and get there. Well, that would have some different inputs. That'd have some different process controls in place. But if you're driving yourself, well, then our inputs and our process controls are a bit different. So what are some inputs? We need the car. We need it to be maintained. So we'll, dot there. We need fuel. That's a much bigger input now than it has been recently. And then we've got our process controls for what are these? These are, we'll just say, rules of the road. Right. So we've got all of the various legal requirements that go into play. We have our route and navigation method. Maybe use Google, maybe use Waze, maybe use an old school map. Maybe you just got a good map up inside your head and you've done it a lot of times. But we're going to identify all these things here. And, maybe we also need to put in here, we have our work schedule. It's going to be a process control. Not going to go to work Saturday if you don't work on Saturday. Now, it might sound a little silly to put it on here, but it's really hard to put too much information on one of these process maps. But once you've taken the time to go through this process map and you've identified all of the little pieces and all of the different caveats to it, you can very quickly say, okay, well, we are having a consistent issue with on-time arrival. Where in our process could things be going wrong? And it's now very visual. So everyone working on this can very clearly see what you're talking about. Well, we're having a problem arriving. Why is that? This would be very true for me currently, is I have a flat tire about once a week. So now we live 8 miles down a dirt road, and I've got a little bitty Toyota that I bought when I wasn't intending to drive 8 miles down a dirt and gravel road every single day. But it means that I pick up a nail or a rock makes a small puncture. So I've got a flat to low tire about once a week. So one of my unfortunate process controls now is I need to check my tire pressure every day when I get home from work and re-air it if I need to make sure that I can get there on time tomorrow. So I've got some different process controls in here. I've got some different inputs that have to come into play. But maybe your on-time arrivals due to traffic because you have to drive through Houston every day, like I did not too recently ago. Okay, well, maybe we need to find a different route to get to work. Maybe your navigation method needs improved. If you're just relying on your own know-how of how to get there, I got to tell you, I love that Google kind of tells me, hey, this route's currently delayed. You need to take that route instead. So that gives us an idea of what could we tweak, what could we change. And all of that, again, falls into this plan, do, check, act model. So we did our checks, something was wrong, and we had to identify the appropriate action and build that back into our plan. So again, while the PDCA cycle is really, really great to understand the process, it kind of stinks at documenting it. So that is where we use what we call our integrative process approach. This I'll give you is a modification of the typical turtle diagram. The typical turtle diagram, I'm not going to go into it much here, but we didn't come up with this totally from scratch. But the typical turtle diagram is very much for identifying what the process is, and it's really valuable for an auditor, but it's not the most valuable for a problem-solving tool. So that's where we really, really like this specific method for process mapping. So if this is something that's useful to you, if you'd like to have a chance to go through and map one of your processes with me, we never charge for a phone call. You can always book a 30-minute meeting with me directly. Just go to book.texasqa.com and you'll find the information there. But I'd love to chat with you. I'd love to help you make some improvements to your process and find some faster and easier ways to get the job done, to identify opportunities for improvement, and to work to solve them. So if we can be of any help to you, let us know. I look forward to talking to you soon. You have a great day.